Welcome to another edition of a Firms Consulting case video. Today we're going to look at operations cases, and I must say that invariably I find most candidates struggle with operations cases. It seems that everyone wants to be a strategy consultant. Everyone spends their time looking at strategy cases such as how do you enter a market, what do you do if a product line is failing, how do you deal with the deregulation of the market. And while those are exciting cases, and to be fair, I used to be a corporate strategy consultant, so I do find them interesting. The reality is that operations cases are an essential part of case interviewing, and you have to understand them. And to be honest, operations cases are more difficult than strategy cases, because in strategy cases, most people can figure their way through them. But in operations cases, unless you really understand the language and you have some context, you are going to fail. So what we're going to do is we're going to present an operations case here that tests whether you understand the basics or the first principles of operations. If you don't understand the first principles of operations, you would not be able to solve this case. And invariably, you would not be able to solve the even more complex operations cases. And as I mentioned many times, and as this case is going to show, operations cases are numerically challenging because you tend to be dealing with unit allocations and little tiny numbers that you need to add up across. Now, the thing about operations cases, if you do want to learn about operations cases, you can go read several books. A book that we recommend is the book The Goal by, I think it's Dr. Eli Goldratt. You don't need to read the whole book. I think it's about 300 pages. You could get a summary, and there are many summaries available of that book. In fact, the 2 to 3 page summary just explain the core concepts would be more than enough for you. But that is for a different day. Today we'll assume that you have an understanding of operations, so you can maybe go ahead and pause this case. And if you don't have an understanding, we'll teach you the basics of operations. The case we're going to do is a Mckinsey case. It's rated at the difficult level, and it takes about 30 to 40 minutes to solve this case. The math should come quick because it's basic math, but the logic of how you're going to do these things should take a little bit longer. The case is Pepsi has one major bottling plant in Los Angeles. In the last 3 months, inventory has more than doubled, while customer complaints, that's the people that Pepsi bottling company is delivering the cans of cola to, or the bottles of cola, are complaining because basically, we don't know why, but their complaints have gone up 5-fold. So the question is, what would you do? Well, in a real case, the first thing you got to do is understand all of the information you've been presented with. So for me personally, the thing that stands out here that I'm not very clear about is when they talk about customer complaints, they haven't explained why there are customer complaints, right? And as you know, as we teach our candidates, if you experience or you're given a lot of data, the odds are pretty good that they're expecting a framework before any clarifying questions, right? That's pretty much the way Mckinsey and Bain handle cases. And while this is a Mckinsey case, I've kind of presented it like a BCG model with very little data. The conceptual issues are hidden and you've got to dig it out. In a Mckinsey case, they tell you really, really clearly, this is the only problem. There are no curveballs. Move ahead with the case, right? So let's now explore this case. Given the fact that so little information has been presented to us, I think it's fair to say that we can ask additional questions. But even so, just to be fair, I would always check with the interviewer whether he wants my clarifying questions or whether he wants to see my approach first. And let's assume this is a friendly guy. He had breakfast this morning and is really happy to have a good chat with you. So what are the questions I would ask him? Well, firstly, inventory could mean many things. Is it finished inventory that's sitting in a warehouse? Or is it inventory in progress? That's an inventory that's arriving from suppliers. Very important point, because depending on the inventory you have, it's either a delivery problem or it's a production problem, because inventory in progress is coming into the manufacturing process. Finished goods inventory has left the manufacturing process. Why are customers complaining? That's an obvious one. I think many of us would have picked that up if we were doing this case. I'd like to know about how much we want to reduce inventory and customer delivery times. I think that gives us a target we're trying to chase. And as you know, most candidates do struggle with cases because while they do the cases well, they don't know where the deadline is. And if you know about how much the interviewer wants you to reduce inventory and customer delivery times, you know when to stop the case when you reach that target. Then obviously I'd like to know, are there any other objectives? Is profitability, return on investment, return on invested capital? Are there any other targets we need to worry about? And of course, if there's more targets than just inventory and customer complaints, the case becomes much more difficult because the more targets you're trying to chase, the more things you have to keep in the back of your head. So let's assume that we're told that all of the inventory is from suppliers, so it's coming in before the manufacturing process. Customers are complaining because their delivery times have gone up dramatically, tripled to gone up to about 5 times. Inventory reduction and customer delivery time reductions as much as possible, and there are no other objectives. Well, what do we do now? Well, the next step should be quite obvious. Now that we've been given all this information, I would take a few seconds. I tell the interviewer, could I take a few seconds to gather my thoughts? And I would present my key question. How can we reduce inventory costs and customer delivery times at the LA bottling plant? Now, the kind of framework we give you here is a framework that if you presented it to an interviewer, he would be unhappy. So listen very carefully to what I'm going to tell you next. He would be unhappy, so that you need to handle this in a certain way. So let's present the framework and show you how you handle it. First, you need to look at inbound logistics. That is stuff that is coming into the manufacturing process. We know there's a problem with supplies, but we don't know if it's a problem with suppliers, right? There could be a problem with suppliers on our side in the way we order, or there could be a problem with suppliers on the way they fulfill our orders. Manufacturing, we've been given no indication that manufacturing is a problem, right? So for now, we just assume there's no problem there. And we know that in terms of outbound logistics, we have some information saying that deliveries are a problem. For those of you who are not familiar with this entire 3-step process is known as the supply chain. If you go into an interview and tell an interviewer, I'm going to analyze the entire supply chain, that's my framework, they will laugh at you or they'll throw something at you, hopefully something that heavy. So what you've got to tell an interviewer is that preempt them, say, look, I understand this is the entire supply chain, and I by no means intend to say that this is my entire framework. This is just some considerations, and what I'm going to do now is identify which part I'm going to analyze and why. That way we can narrow down our framework to just one point that we want to analyze and focus our case. Make sense? Let's continue. The step from here is obviously asking a few questions to determine whether the problem lies in the inbound side, on the manufacturing side, or the outbound side. And you've got to be efficient. You can't ask a lot of questions. You've got to ask 1 or 2 questions that eloquently and efficiently show you understand the problem. So what would those questions be? Well, firstly, I would like to know why we are buying more materials. Well, clearly there's some hold up there, so why are we buying more materials? Has anything changed in the manufacturing process? You'd be shocked how many people forget to ask this really basic question. And it just baffles me. We've been doing these cases with some Korean students recently, and one of the things you've got to understand about the Korean education system is it's quite advanced. But operations cases don't seem to be on the table or on the menu for South Korean students. They're really good at strategy cases, but they really mess up operations cases. And I just did a session with about maybe 5 Korean students, and all of them failed to get this issue. Now, it's not just Korea that struggles here, because obviously an outstanding education system, but we find invariably candidates from across the world struggle because no one is primed to think in operations terms. Outbound logistics, I would like to know why customer orders are delivered late. So you look at the sequence here, right? We were told they're complaining, then we found out why they're complaining, because they are delivered late, and now we want to know why they are delivered late. So let's see what the interviewer tells us. Well, he's going to tell me demand has gone up from 6,000 bottles a day to 10,000 bottles a day since it is now summer. That makes sense. As demand goes up, you'll buy more raw materials, more inventory to fulfill demand. They've changed nothing in the manufacturing. So it's interesting because the manufacturing process for 6,000 bottles is the same as the manufacturing process for 10,000 bottles. Not necessarily a good thing, but a clue as well. And customer orders are late because the factory is not producing sufficient cola to meet demand, and we are forced to cancel shipments, right? Now, here's some interesting clues for you that you can take and work with, right? And very basic stuff here. Basically, due to demand, an increase in demand, more supplies are being bought. But due to something in manufacturing, those supplies are not being converted to finished products, which is why there's a delay with customers. So clearly there's a manufacturing problem because you've got enough inbound supplies coming in, but they're not being converted in the manufacturing process. And obviously the outbound process is failing because there's nothing to take from manufacturing to customers. So let's explain this with some numbers, right? Let's look at the former state before demand went up. Demand was 6,000 bottles a day, right? So my hypothesis is that due to a bottleneck or other manufacturing problem, this is causing an inventory buildup and manufacturing shortfall, which is leading to customer delays. And notice the fact that I've got 3 parts to my hypothesis. An hypothesis can never be that there's a manufacturing problem. That is an hypothesis that belongs in a non-accredited college. If you go to an accredited college, you should understand an hypothesis must have three parts. You must have the observable phenomenon, the cause, and the effect. If you gave me an hypothesis with just two of the three parts, I'm okay with it. But if you give me an hypothesis that cannot be tested, if you just tell me something like there's a manufacturing problem and you cannot test it, that's never going to fly. So let's look at this in a graphical layout. So let's lay out the manufacturing process. Let's assume there's just three parts to the manufacturing process, right? The first part is where you get the bottles and you sterilize it, and let's assume the capacity of that plant per day, of that part of the plant per day, is 10,000 bottles a day. Filling of the bottles with cola, the capacity is 9,000 bottles a day, and the bottling, when I mean bottling, I mean putting a cap on those bottles, is 8,000 bottles a day, right? So let's look what happens on a typical week. You've got 6,000 bottles bought because that's the demand per day. The product deficit, that means that the demand that is not met is zero because all 6,000 can go through the production process because the bottleneck is above 6,000. And that happens for the whole week from day 1 to day 2 to day 3 to day 4 to day 5. So everyone's happy. All the customers are happy, right? But what happens when demand grows to 10,000 bottles a day? Well, the bottling side where you're putting a cap becomes a bottleneck because if demand exceeds supply, you have a bottleneck. And if you have a bottleneck, it's automatically a production problem. So now we know we have a bottleneck. And what does that mean in terms of happy or unhappy customers? Well, let's erase this and see what that means. So we now have 10,000 bottles of inventory being bought, right? That's logical, right? What is the product deficit? Well, in the first day, you're going to have 10,000 bottles going into the manufacturing process and being queued up. Only 8,000 bottles are going to come up. So in terms of the product deficit, demand not being met, we have 2,000 bottles not being met, right? Make sense? Let's go to day 2, right? In day 2, what's going to happen? Well, in day 2, what you have is that from day 1, you've got 2,000 bottles that have queued up as an excess inventory, so waiting to come in. And then in day 2, you've got the 2,000 bottle deficit from day 1 plus the 2,000 bottle deficit from day 2, giving you 4,000 bottles of demand that are not being met. Day 3, same thing, right? In day 2, you now have 4,000 bottles queuing up plus the 2,000 that are going to come in from day 3. You've got a 6,000 bottle deficit, and you can simply repeat the process. And what happens when you repeat the process is you find out that this very innocuous bottleneck problem is causing a dramatic queue whereby by the end of the first week, you're going to have 10,000 bottles queuing up. And if 10,000 bottles are queuing up for manufacturing, that means 10,000 bottles that need to go through manufacturing are not going through manufacturing. And you've got a product deficit of 10,000. Now that we've outlined this problem, hopefully a little bit eloquently, what do we do with this? Well, if you've identified the problem, the next step is obviously to generate options to fix said problem. You have two options here. The first option is you can fix the bottleneck so that all the supplies are used and there is no product deficit and or inventory buildup. Now, McKinsey particularly, and I would say all firms, want to see creativity. I get really bored of a case when someone is just throwing out the most basic stuff, right? So let's look for a really creative answer here. We know this is a seasonal problem because during summer, the problem occurs. So another more creative solution is that we shift production to a neighboring bottler like maybe, I don't know, Nevada, I think is close to California, and we import the product deficit into Los Angeles. We could even shift production to maybe a neighboring bottler, maybe in San Diego, San Francisco, somewhere within California. But the point is you don't have to necessarily do any changes to the LA plant. Now, obviously here you've got to prioritize which option do you analyze first, right? Once you've presented your options, you've got to analyze them. You've got to analyze them on certain criteria and decide which option you want to pursue. Dealing with your own plant is probably the best thing to do because potentially there are ways to fix your bottleneck without incurring significant costs. You want to look at that first, and only if that's not a solution, then you look at making massive capital changes or shifting production. So let's explore that. Let's take this even further, right? So if we want to fix the bottleneck, we have three options. We can move quality and assurance before the bottleneck.
I can assure you right now, when I tell people this is a potential solution, they look at me with a blank face, or they look at me like I just told them the earth is actually flat and it's not round. Expanding the bottleneck is an obvious solution. That's what most people say. And sharing the bottleneck work with another part of the plant. There may be another part of the plant who could do the same work as the bottleneck with a few changes. So that's a creative, and it's usually possible, because what happens is plants do have spare equipment, or they do have other equipment that can do the work of the bottleneck. So now let's look at the one about moving Q&A before the bottleneck. I'm going to explore this in more detail because it's the one most people would understand the least. But of course, all of them you have to explore, right? You have to look at the criterion. What is the cost-benefit analysis of doing each to come up with a recommendation? But we're just going to look at the Q&A one because I think it makes the most sense here. So let's look at moving Q&A before the bottleneck. Now, what does this mean, right? Let's go back to our plant. We've got 3 steps in the plant: sterilizing the bottles, filling them up with cola, and then putting a little cap on them. On the day one, we've got 10,000 bottles. If the bottleneck is 8,000, we assume 8,000 bottles will come out. But that's not true. The apparent capacity of the plant is only 100%. That is true. The apparent capacity is 100%. In reality, you are going to have some defects occurring. Let's assume the defects are 5%, right? Which is 400 bottles. The real capacity of the plant is 95%. And if you spread this across, you know you're losing 400 bottles a day for the plant, right? So 5% of products going through the bottleneck will be rejected, meaning the bottleneck is not working at 100% capacity, but rather just 95% capacity. So what you can do is, you can see here that if you look at the losses, they're quite significant. They keep on adding up every single day, right? So it's 400 a day. If you can move the Q&A step before the bottleneck, right, you would remove these products before they entered the bottleneck. So rather than sending only 7,600 good products to the bottleneck, you would send 8,000 products to the bottleneck, because the products that were going to be kicked out after the bottleneck would be kicked out before the bottleneck, thereby only sending good products to the bottleneck. What this means is that if you move the Q&A or part of the Q&A before the bottleneck, you ensure maximum product is produced. But now the case you have to ask yourself is, while you can fix this and it's quite easy to fix, should you make capital expansions to address the 1,600 bottles that you still need to find? Remember, demand is 10,000. If you've found another 400, you've got 8,400 moving through, which means you've got 1,600 bottles that are not moving through. Now, since this is seasonal, importing seems to make more sense to me. I would actually say, why go through all these capital changes when just for 4 or 5 months of the year we can get another plant to work at maybe slightly higher capacity without any changes to their production, right? So let's just recap where we've come with this case. Well, you've got to tie up the case, right? And that's what I mean when I say recap. And this is what I'll do. I'll tell the interviewer that in this case, the inventory buildup and delays in customer deliveries are driven by the same problem, right? It's basically a bottleneck in the bottling step of the bottling plant. And to fix the problem, we can do many things, but the simplest thing we can do immediately with least amount of effort is move Q&A before the bottleneck. We can improve throughput capacity by 5%, and we assume it'll cost us nothing, right? This means that we still need to find another 1,600 bottles per day, right? And there are 2 ways we can address this. We can introduce capital expansion into the plant, or we can shift capacity to another plant that may have idle capacity, right? And of course, comparing the capital side of things, capital changes, and comparing the broad option of shifting capacity to another plant, we'll have to do a cost-benefit analysis. But all other things being equal, shifting it, because it's seasonal and it's going to come back to normal, shifting it to another plant would tend to make the most amount of sense to me. So now that we've covered this case, let's sort of recap some of the key things you need to know. The observations here is that in the supply chain, everything needs to be broken down into 3 convenient steps, but you gotta understand that this is a very broad process. And if you just tell the interviewer you're going to go with the entire supply chain, they're not going to be happy. So you have to quickly follow that up by saying that I'm going to use a few sets of clarifying questions to pinpoint where I think the problem is and develop an hypothesis, and that is where we will focus the analysis. When you think of a supply chain, you should think of a set of dominoes. You move one part of the domino, there's a ripple effect across the supply chain. Your job is to find the relationship between these seemingly unrelated problems. Because here we saw that inventory was a problem and customers. At no time did we think that manufacturing could be a problem until we understood the relationship of the different parts of production in a supply chain. I'll tell you again, operations cases are very numerical, require lots of calculations, and I love doing them with candidates in the final stages of their training. One of the most famous cases we do is the Russian mobile telecommunications case, looking at how dropped calls increases during the Russian, within Moscow peak rush hour between 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock. Failure rate on that case sits at close to about 100%. And I always find that candidates make mistakes here because of unit conversions. You're dealing with bottles per day, bottles per cycle, setup per time, number of people per hour, labor costs per a unit of product. You don't use units, you are going to die. For those of you who are in our training and have gone through our estimation cases, you know how important unit conversions are. In operations cases, you think of a very big estimation case with a lot of different equations. Equations without units is language without structure. No structure, no understanding, everything fails. Operations cases can always be broken down to 3 steps. If you don't understand bottlenecks in operations cases, you are dead. Understand that process. The principles of solving operations cases, for those of you who've been through the training, you'd know we take this directly into estimation cases when we look at supply and demand. We take it into telecoms cases. We take it heavily into IT cases. The point is, knowing operations cases is not just important for operations cases. It's important for all kinds of cases. Now, if you really want to improve your knowledge, you should understand marginal cost analysis, because I find that when we give you a case with an operations concept and marginal costing, I would say most candidates fail them. Most candidates really struggle to understand this concept, and you should look it up, because in future cases that you do with us, we are going to throw this concept at you. These cases tend to be very long. There's no way you're going to be able to go through inbound logistics, manufacturing, outbound logistics from top to bottom. You'd be there forever. Your job is to quickly pinpoint the problem and let the interviewer know that you know the framework is too big and that you understand you have to pinpoint the problem, right? So let's just look at how candidates have done generally in this case. So what we've done here is we've taken a case summary looking at how candidates have done across the last 2 years with us on this kinds of cases. In terms of case skill requirements, you have to be very good at case structuring and very good at communication to solve operations cases. Very good at case structuring, because if you have the wrong structure, you are basically going around in a maze. Or you're going to have to, if you use the wrong structure, the structure may turn out to be so cumbersome to use, you are never, ever going to develop it, right? You're never going to solve the problem. The second thing is because you're dealing with so many units of calculations, or bottles per day, cost per hour, units per second, unless you are really communicating what you want to do, why you want to do it, how you want to do it, there's a great chance of miscommunication. And I know many candidates will resonate with the point I'm going to make. If you ask me the wrong question and I answer the question correctly, you are screwed. And I do find that with many candidates. What they want to ask me and what they ask me as the interviewer is very different from what they intend to ask. And if you ask the wrong question, I give you the right information for the wrong question, you're going to end up being totally lost in a case, especially when you're dealing with these very nuanced units of conversion. But how do candidates do? Well, I would say that the reason this case is so challenging is because it expects you to understand operations cases at its core. The case is not challenging, but the principles it applies means you must understand operations. And if you don't, well, you know what? You're dead. How do candidates do? I find MBA candidates do okay in this case. They tend to do well on business judgment. They tend to do well on case structuring because most MBA schools have taught an operations course. And a lot of candidates can bring that to the table. But I can tell you right now, all MBA students struggle, and I don't think anyone's ever finished this case. So while their business judgment may be strong, they're not able to parlay that into communicating with me effectively to extract good insights from me as the interviewer, but also from extracting guidance from me. And case structuring I find to be quite weak for MBA candidates. What I do find is that undergraduates tend to be weak on communication and weak on business judgment. And they're weak on business judgment here because I do find that undergraduate programs in business and generally history, art, sciences don't teach operations. So operations is something you've got to read. And the only reason undergraduate students do badly is because they don't have this operations background. But I do still feel that our undergraduate candidates do better on the arithmetic and calculations than our MBA candidates. And this is looking across the last year and sort of averaging out performance for all the candidates who have been through the program.
Why will you fail this case? You have weak operations knowledge. You need to get the summary of operations from any MBA textbook and you'll be fine. As always, I'll be happy to respond to any questions, and I do hope that you found this case to be very useful to your preparation and training. Thank you.